This final video in the Bioreactor Basics module addresses one of the most common questions for bioreactors. How long do the wood chips last? We'll talk specifically about recharging, that is, replacing the wood chips once it's time to do that. What you will see over time at a bioreactor is that the top of the bioreactor will subside. Subsidence is totally normal. Some bioreactors subside faster than others, some within a couple years, but these are wood chips after all. They're not going to last forever, and so we should set our expectations appropriately. I'll also point out that just because the top has sunk doesn't mean the bioreactor is not working. For example, here was a 5-year-old bioreactor that was still removing nitrate, not as well as it did in the first year, but there was water still going through it at 5 years old and nitrate was being removed. We're doing 3D scans like this to better understand and quantify subsidence with bioreactor age and with or without a soil cover. This subsidence is still something that we're working to understand, but it is normal. Even though a bioreactor is likely still working if you see subsidence, we do want to avoid bioreactor ponding of surface runoff. So if your bioreactor is uncovered with wood chips all the way to the top, adding extra wood chips on top to route the runoff water away is okay to do. If your bioreactor has a soil cover, we do not recommend adding extra soil to the top. Actually, the best way to route surface runoff away is by constructing a berm between the bioreactor and the upslope area during initial bioreactor construction. But keep in mind, as I filmed this in 2023, we're still developing the best long-term bioreactor management guidance. So how long exactly will the wood chips last before they need to be entirely replaced? Our current guidance is to plan for recharge or wood chip replacement at about 10 years. I've seen a couple recharges happen as soon as 5 years, but I think that's relatively very early. Our 10-year recommendation is consistent with the NRCS practice standard, which calls for a design life of 10 years. Some nuance here is that if you calculate the carbon balance based on how much carbon is in the wood chips and how much carbon will be consumed by denitrification based on the stoichiometry, the mass of wood chips we use gives us enough carbon to last many decades. And in fact, when we tested these 9-year-old wood chips to see if they could still support nitrate removal, they did. In little batch tests where we added wood chips to drainage water with nitrate in it, the nitrate concentrations decreased in those jars, which indicated the wood chips were not carbon limited even at 9 years old. So we've discovered that rather than running out of carbon, wood chips in bioreactors need to be recharged, usually more because of a failure in hydraulic properties that happens over time. Or in other words, as the wood chips break down, their particle size decreases and water has a harder and harder time making it through the wood chips. In this one specific case where we studied this, that flow restriction was exacerbated by sediment from the drainage system getting into the bioreactor. Flow restriction likely led to the water finding preferential flow paths through the wood chips, meaning it spent very little time in the bioreactor, and flow restriction in the wood chips also caused more and more water to bypass the bioreactor. And that's when we need to recharge. It's not necessarily a carbon limitation. The last thing I'll mention is that we do know that keeping the wood chips wet makes them last longer. For example, when wood chips were buried near tile lines in this study, the wood chips that were deeper and were below the water table only lost about 15% of their mass over 9 years, compared to the wood chips that were only a couple feet down in the soil and that were getting wetted up and dried out. Those lost about 80% of their mass over 9 years. And just to illustrate that point with wood chips we've excavated from a 6-year-old bioreactor, the wood chips from the top look more like soil, more broken down, whereas the wood chips from the bottom appear to have retained their shape better. This makes sense because you've read those stories about logs that have fallen off of a ship, fallen to the bottom of a lake, and the wood lasts decades. That's because decomposition is an aerobic process. And if you keep the wood chips wet and underwater and anaerobic, the wood won't degrade. However, remember, we do need to dry the bioreactor down in the summer so we don't have that rotten egg sulfate reduction smell. So we really cannot keep the wood chips wet just all of the time. So how do you know if it's time to recharge the wood chips? Check the outflow. If the flow rate coming out of the bioreactor is consistently low, even when the tiles are flowing a lot, that's the best and easiest indicator then it might be time to recharge. This will probably be within that roughly 10-year window, and you will have had some subsidence to confirm that it's time. It is not recommended to just add wood chips on the top of the bioreactor. Adding wood chips on the top helps address surface runoff getting into the bioreactor. Recharging means excavating the bottom wood chips out. If you don't do that, then you're not addressing the actual flow problems. A benefit here of bioreactors without a soil cover is that you won't have to additionally dig through the soil cover, but you have to have an excavator out there either way, soil cover or not, to do a recharge. During the recharge process, the control structures can be left in place and continue to be used at least through 1 or maybe 2 recharges. You will need to replace the plastic liner for the sides and bottom because that will likely get torn no matter how good your contractor is. And I would also replace the flow manifold piping since you'll be in there anyway. It's relatively cheap to replace and to make sure it's not getting plugged. Finally, I'll note that the NRCS does have an EQIP payment rate approved for bioreactor recharge, which is really nice to see. But honestly, there's just been so few bioreactor recharges to date. So, as I've noted, we're still improving our understanding of bioreactor recharge to develop better guidance for the future. Thanks for joining. See you in the next module.